Nancy tightened her grip on the steering wheel, the glow of the dashboard lights casting a faint luminescence on her tense face. The narrow, winding road ahead was barely visible under the pale beam of her headlights. It was late, too late, and the isolation of the road combined with the suffocating darkness made her uneasy. She had taken this route many times before, a shortcut through the dense woods to reach her cabin faster. Tonight, however, felt different. The stillness was oppressive, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Nancy glanced at her phone on the passenger seat. No signal. Typical. She mentally kicked herself for not leaving earlier, but the long day at the office had drained her. She just wanted to get to the cabin and sleep. Suddenly, a flash of movement in the rearview mirror caught her eye. She squinted into the darkness but saw nothing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to keep driving. Just nerves, she told herself. Just your mind playing tricks. As the road twisted and turned, she felt a chill creeping up her spine. She tried to shake it off, but the sensation lingered. She fiddled with the radio, hoping some music would calm her nerves, but all she got was static. With a frustrated sigh, she turned it off. Minutes felt like hours. Each bend in the road seemed to lead to more impenetrable darkness, and then she saw it again. A flash of movement, this time more distinct. Her eyes darted to the mirror, and she saw the outline of the vehicle's headlights far behind her, barely visible but unmistakably there. Relief washed over her briefly. Another car, she wasn't alone. But as she kept glancing back, the relief turned to confusion and then to fear. The car wasn't gaining on her. It was maintaining the same distance, almost as if it was following her. Her grip on the wheel tightened further. Nancy's mind raced. Should she pull over and let the car pass, or speed up and try to lose it? She opted for the latter, pressing down on the gas pedal. The engine roared, and the car sped up, but the mysterious vehicle matched her pace, never getting closer, never falling behind. Her heart was pounding now, and her palms were slick with sweat. She glanced at her phone again. Still no signal. Panic started to set in. She didn't know who was in that car or what they wanted, but she wasn't about to find out. She needed to get to her cabin, where she knew she would be safe. The road became bumpier as she pushed the car harder, the trees on either side a blur. She could barely see the road signs, but she knew she was close. Just a few more miles. She risked another glance in the mirror. The car was still there, its headlights unwavering. Nancy's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she rounded the final bend. Her cabin's driveway came into view, and she turned sharply, tires screeching on the gravel. She sped down the short path and skidded to a stop in front of the cabin, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She darted inside and slammed the door behind her, locking it with shaking fingers. Her heart was still racing as she peered out the window, expecting to see the car pulling in behind her. But the driveway was empty. She blinked, confusion mingling with her fear. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her after all? She watched the empty driveway for several minutes, waiting for the car that never came. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath and backed away from the window. The cabin was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She leaned against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired and paranoid. She needed to rest. But as she headed towards the bedroom, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. With dread pooling in her stomach, Nancy turned back towards the window. She could barely see through the darkness outside, but the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. She took a cautious step forward, her heart in her throat, and peered through the glass. There, in the faint light from the porch, was a hand pressed against the window pane, fingers tapping rhythmically. Nancy's breath caught in her throat as her eyes followed the arm up to a shadowy figure standing just outside, staring back at her with cold, unblinking eyes. Nancy stumbled back, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone, desperately hoping for a signal. Nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She had to do something. She couldn't stay here. She moved towards the back door, trying to be as quiet as possible. Maybe she could slip out and run to a neighbor's house. She reached for the doorknob, but hesitated. What if there were more of them outside? What if this was a trap? The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. She held her breath, listening intently. Then a slow, deliberate creaking sound came from the front door. Someone was trying to open it. Panic surged through her. She needed a weapon, anything to defend herself. She scanned the room and grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace. The door creaked again, louder this time. Nancy tightened her grip on the poker, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound strong. No response, just the sound of the door creaking open, inch by agonizing inch. She backed away, her eyes never leaving the door. A shadowy figure slipped through the gap, moving slowly, deliberately. Nancy's heart pounded in her chest. She raised the poker, ready to strike. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a man with a gaunt face and cold, calculating eyes. He smiled, a chilling, empty smile that sent shivers down her spine. "What do you want?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man said nothing, just continued to smile as he stepped closer. Nancy swung the poker, but he caught it with surprising speed, wrenching it from her grasp. She stumbled back, fear gripping her. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's not safe." Nancy's mind raced. She had to get out, had to find help. She turned and ran towards the back door, but he was faster. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back with a force that knocked the wind out of her. "Please," she gasped, "let me go." The man's grip tightened, his smile never faltering. "You need to learn to be more careful, Nancy." Her blood ran cold. He knew her name. How did he know her name? She struggled, trying to break free, but his grip was ironclad. Tears blurred her vision as she fought with all her strength. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the front of the cabin. The man's grip loosened just enough for her to wrench free. She bolted for the back door, throwing it open and sprinting into the night. The woods were dark and disorienting, but she didn't care. She ran, branches scratching at her arms and face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear him behind her, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on her. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself and kept running. Her lungs burned, her legs ached. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. Up ahead, she saw a faint light, a neighbor's house. She poured on every last bit of speed she had, praying she could make it. She burst into the clearing, screaming for help. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" he called out. Nancy didn't have time to explain. "Please help me," she cried, collapsing at his feet. Behind her, the figure emerged from the woods, slowing as he saw the neighbor. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes locked on Nancy. The neighbor helped her to her feet, his gaze shifting between her and the man. "Who was that?" he asked, a note of alarm in his voice. Nancy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she sobbed. "He's been following me. Please, don't let him take me." The neighbor nodded, stepping in front of her protectively. "You need to leave," he shouted at the man. "Now." For a moment, the man stood there, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the woods. Nancy watched him go, her heart still racing. The neighbor led her inside, locking the door behind them. "You're safe now," he said gently. "We'll call the police." Nancy nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She was safe for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ray squinted through the windshield, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding road. The headlights of his old Satan sliced through the inky darkness, illuminating the narrow path ahead. The dense forest on either side seemed to close in on him, the trees casting eerie, dancing shadows. It was supposed to be a quick drive back to his hometown, a surprise visit to his parents after being away for years. But the GPS had malfunctioned, leading him down this isolated, unfamiliar route. The occasional chirp of crickets and the rustling of leaves were the only sounds accompanying him on this desolate stretch. Glancing at the clock on the dashboard, Ray noted it was nearing midnight. He hadn't seen another car for miles, and a gnawing sense of unease started to creep in. The road seemed endless, each bend revealing only more darkness. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the car. Ray's heart leaped into his throat as he swerved, barely keeping the vehicle on the road. He slowed to a stop, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. Did he hit something? Or someone? Ray turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. The headlights cast a harsh glow on the asphalt, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. He walked around the car, inspecting it for damage. The front bumper had a fresh dent, but there was no sign of what caused it. As he stood there, contemplating his next move, a faint sound reached his ears. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. Ray's pulse quickened. He turned toward the forest, straining to see through the thick underbrush. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Hello," Ray called out, his voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" No response. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Ray's instinct screamed at him to get back in the car and drive, but his curiosity won out. He took a few cautious steps toward the trees, peering into the darkness. A sudden rustling made him jump. Ray's eyes widened as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man disheveled and dirty, with wild eyes that glinted in the moonlight. He stared at Ray with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Are you okay?" Ray asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. Ray took an involuntary step back, his heart pounding in his ears. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Ray stammered. "I just heard something and wanted to make sure everything was all right." The man's lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "Everything is far from all right," he rasped. "You shouldn't be here." Ray's mind raced. He needed to get back to the car and leave. Now, but before he could move, the man lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Ray struggled, his hands grappling for something, anything to defend himself. His fingers closed around a rock, and he swung it wildly, connecting with the man's temple. The man collapsed, unconscious. Ray scrambled to his feet, his body trembling. He stumbled back to the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Fumbling with the keys, he managed to unlock the door and slide behind the wheel. He started the engine, his hands shaking, and floored the accelerator. As he sped away, Ray glanced in the rearview mirror. The man lay motionless on the road, but something in the forest caught his eye. Another figure, barely visible, standing among the trees, watching him. Ray's blood ran cold. He had to get out of here, and fast. But as he drove deeper into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, that the nightmare was far from over. Ray's eyes flicked between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, paranoia gnawing at him. The figure in the forest had been unsettling, but the thought of more people, or things, lurking in the darkness was terrifying. He pressed down harder on the accelerator, the engine groaning in protest. After what felt like an eternity, Ray saw the faint glow of a gas station sign in the distance. Relief washed over him. He pulled in, the tires crunching on the gravel as he came to a stop. The station was old and rundown, but it was a lifeline. Ray hurried inside, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The cashier, a bored-looking teenager, barely glanced up from his phone. Ray grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and approached the counter. "Can I use your phone?" Ray asked, his voice hoarse. The cashier looked up, raising an eyebrow. "No phone. Only got cell service out here." Ray cursed under his breath. "Do you know where the nearest town is? I think I took a wrong turn." "Nearest town's about 30 miles back the way you came," the cashier said, chewing gum lazily. "You're pretty much in the middle of nowhere." Ray's heart sank. He couldn't go back, not after what happened. He thanked the cashier and headed back to his car, feeling more isolated than ever. As he reached for the car door, he froze. A piece of paper was stuck under the windshield wiper. Ray pulled it out, his hands trembling. It was a note scrawled in messy handwriting. "You can't escape. We're always watching." Ray's blood ran cold. He scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. His mind raced with possibilities. Who were they? How had they found him so quickly? He got back into the car, locking the doors behind him. He needed to think. He needed a plan. Ray decided to drive until he found a safer place, somewhere he could call for help and figure out what was going on. He started the car and pulled out of the gas station, the note still clutched in his hand. The road ahead was long and dark, but Ray forced himself to stay focused. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. The drive was a blur of anxiety and fear, every shadow and sound magnified in his mind. After about an hour, he saw the faint outline of a motel sign. It was old and dingy, but it was a place to rest and regroup. Ray parked and went inside, relieved to find the lobby empty except for the night clerk, an older woman with a kind face. He booked a room and hurried down the dimly lit hallway, feeling a strange mix of safety and dread. Once inside the room, Ray locked the door and collapsed on the bed. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear, but exhaustion soon took over. He fell into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of dark forests and watching eyes. A loud bang jolted him awake. Ray sat up, heart pounding, listening intently. The sound had come from outside the room. He crept to the door, pressing his ear against it. "Ray." His blood ran cold at the sound of his name. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. How did they know his name? Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently. Ray's breath caught in his throat. He needed to find something to defend himself. His eyes darted around the room, settling on the bedside lamp. He grabbed it, holding it like a weapon. The door burst open, and Ray swung the lamp with all his might. It connected with a sickening thud, and the intruder crumpled to the floor. Ray's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked down at the unconscious figure. It was the same man from the forest, his wild eyes now closed. Ray's relief was short-lived. Another figure appeared in the doorway, a woman, her face twisted with anger. She lunged at him, and Ray barely had time to react. He struggled, but she was strong, her hands closing around his throat. Just as he thought he would lose consciousness, Ray managed to kick her off, sending her sprawling. He scrambled to his feet and ran out of the room, his mind screaming at him to get away. He burst out of the motel and into the night, the cool air a shock to his system. He ran to his car, fumbling with the keys. Behind him, the woman was getting up, her eyes locked on him with a terrifying intensity. Ray got the car started and tore out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. He drove aimlessly, his only goal to put as much distance as possible between himself and the nightmare he had just escaped. Hours passed, and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Ray's body ached with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. He needed to find help to figure out why he was being hunted. As he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the shadows of the night would follow him into the light of day. The road stretched out before him, a never-ending journey of fear and uncertainty. Ray didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't stop running.